Hey oceanography students. So the second video for this week is on evolution, or how we came to see the diversity of organisms that we have in the world today, and why we see differences in the fossil record in the past. Okay, so where did life come from? Scientists believe that there were a number of steps that happened in order for life to occur. Now, one of those steps is the production of organic molecules such as amino acids. So this is showing you an example of an experiment that was done to show or to see, investigate, whether or not life, or I should say not life, but organic molecules could emerge from non-organic molecules. So scientists believe that life started in the oceans. And so a scientist who was actually a graduate student at the time by the name of Stanley Miller created this experiment or this contraption that experimented on ocean water that was lacking of any organic molecules. And he also took into consideration what the atmosphere would have been like and what the conditions on Earth would have been like at the time that we believe life came to be. So we believe that life came to be about 4.5 billion years ago. So remember, if we look back to early Earth, 4.5 billion years ago, the atmosphere was made up of essentially a lot of carbon dioxide, a lot of methane, a lot of ammonia, and some hydrogen as well. And it was also subjected to lots of lightning strikes, and it was really warm and all of that. So scientists think, that life started somewhere around the ocean, in the ocean, or possibly around hydrothermal vents, or possibly around volcanoes that were in the ocean, something like that. And so what this scientist did is he took ocean water that was basically he made ocean water. So there were no organic molecules in it. It was basically just water with like minerals and salts. Okay, and so he took it and he heated it up so that it boiled. That basically means that it went from being a liquid to a gas. So that gas rose up into this tube, and as it was in this tube, he opened this valve and put in the concentrations of gases that would have been in our atmosphere at that time. So he added to the water vapor these gases, and then it came over here and he zapped it, basically simulating lightning strikes that would have happened on early Earth. Then he decreased the size of the tubing, which caused the water to condense into a liquid form and fill up in this little trap here. He then took that water from the trap and analyzed it to see if there were any organic molecules there. And he actually found 11 different amino acids in this experiment. So amino acids are not life, but they are the precursors to life. They are basically the first step in how life can come to be. So similar experiments have been done simulating environments that would have been around volcanoes, and they actually found even more amino acids. Other hypotheses are that life actually, or the molecules that produce life actually came from space, and they actually have meteorites that have organic molecules in them as well. So there are lots of different ideas about where this came from, but this is kind of a first step, and the general consensus is that life probably happened in the oceans, or the first life probably happened in the oceans, and the first life would have been prokaryotic organisms, unicellular prokaryotic organisms, simple organisms. Okay, so the first organisms to come to be would have been heterotrophs. Heterotrophs are organisms that have to eat to gain energy, so they were probably consuming other organic molecules that were produced in the way that the organic molecules that made them were produced as well. From those heterotrophs eventually evolved autotrophs, which again make their own food. So the first autotrophs would have been anaerobic bacteria. Anaerobic means without oxygen. So they are essentially making their own food without oxygen, and in the process with oxygen is usually called photosynthesis. So this process is actually called chemosynthesis. And there are lots of anaerobic bacteria in the world today as well. Now, from those anaerobic bacteria evolved photosynthesizing autotrophs. So these would have been organisms that were plant-like. Okay, and the earliest organisms that we actually still have today are called cyanobacteria. They use chlorophyll to capture the sun's energy. And so there's cyanobacteria, that's how that's spelled. So this right here is the equation for photosynthesis. You have water, combine it with carbon dioxide in the presence of light, and you get sugar and produce oxygen in the process. Now, in order for that light to be absorbed, organisms that are photosynthesizers have chlorophyll. Chlorophyll is a pigment that can absorb the energy from the sun. So once we had these organisms that produce oxygen, now our atmosphere can start to have oxygen in it. And once our atmosphere has oxygen in it, we can start to see evolution of organisms that breathe and eat. So these are respiring organisms, and this is the equation for respiration. Sugar plus oxygen makes energy for the body and produces water and carbon dioxide in the process. Now, if you had looked at the previous equation well, you would see that if you read this equation from the right to the left, and instead of saying heat released, it says sunlight added, this would be the process of photosynthesis. So photosynthesis and respiration are complementary to one another. The organisms that photosynthesize make the food that we eat. They also make the oxygen that we breathe. We, in turn, make water, but there's obviously water on Earth as well, and we also produce carbon dioxide, which can be taken up by those organisms. Okay, and that production of carbon dioxide is not to be confused with the production of carbon dioxide by way of combustion. We'll talk about that later on in the semester when we talk about climate change. Okay, so all of these organisms went through evolutionary processes. So what is evolution? Do you have an idea of a definition for evolution? So definition is essentially the process by which modern organisms have descended from ancient organisms, or in other words, it's change over time. Evolution is the change of something over time. So when we talk about evolution in biology, we're talking about this change of organisms over time. And the theory of evolution is a scientific theory by Charles Darwin, published in 1859. But it's just a theory, right? So hopefully you guys listened up in the earliest lecture when we had the scientific method and know that talking about a scientific theory is not the same thing as talking about a theory in everyday speech, right? A scientific theory is a well-supported, testable explanation of phenomena that have occurred in the natural world. It is not an idea that has no evidence like the word that is used in everyday speech. In everyday speech, when you use the term theory, that would be more like using the word hypothesis in scientific speech, right? Or, it's basically just an educated guess. Whereas a theory is something that has been tested over and over again, and it's also been used to predict future outcomes as well. Okay, so in Darwin's time, most people believed that the Earth and everything that was living on the Earth had been created only a few thousand years ago. So Earth was very young, and that everything that was living on Earth was exactly as it had always been. And so the common idea was that we had Earth was young and everything on it always looked the same. Okay, so that's something to think about as we go through this discussion. So Charles Darwin was invited to be the naturalist aboard a voyage on the HMS Beagle. This was to be an expedition sent out from Great Britain to go to South America and circumnavigate the globe, go all the way around the world. Charles Darwin initially was actually studying to be a clergyman. He previously tried to study to be a doctor, but he couldn't stand the sight of blood. As a kid, he was actually a really bad student, but he had a hobby for the natural world. And so he continued that hobby into adulthood. And due to his contributions and in that world in Great Britain, he was asked to be the naturalist aboard the Beagle. So he was the only one who was in charge of recording all of the natural information from all of the places that they visited. So the HMS Beagle set sail in 1831, and during his travels, Darwin made numerous observations and collected evidence that led him to propose a revolutionary hypothesis about the way that life changes over time. Okay, so he collected information in the form of notes and keeping logs. He also collected actual organisms and actual fossils as well. And after returning from his voyage, he could then look at this and that all of the information that he gathered, as well as information that he had learned from other scientists and other knowledge that he already had, led him to produce the theory of evolution. So this is where the Beagle went. It started in Great Britain. It went down the Atlantic Ocean to South America, making multiple stops along the way, along the east coast of South America. It came all the way around through the Strait of Magellan and made multiple stops along the west coast of South America, made multiple important stops in the Galapagos Islands, which are shown here. It went across the Pacific Ocean, making additional stops, also stopped in Australia, also stopped in Africa, back to South America, and back to Great Britain again. So what did Darwin see? So he observed that many plants and animals were well suited to the environment that they inhabited. Okay? But he also noticed that he would see organisms that were found in one place that had a certain characteristic of environment, and he would go to another environment that had the same kind of characteristics, but he wouldn't see that same organism. So, for example, Australia and Argentina have very similar environments, but the habitats are inhabited by totally different organisms. For example, Australia has kangaroos, Argentina has rabbits. Why were there no rabbits in Australia? Why were there no kangaroos in Argentina? He also collected fossils, which are the remains of ancient organisms, and he noticed that some of those fossils that he found actually looked a lot like organisms that live now, but there were also lots of fossils that looked nothing like anything that Darwin had ever seen before. So he wondered to himself, in his logs, why had these other organisms disappeared? Why did we not see them anymore? This clearly shows that life was not always as it is today. And so that is one obvious piece of evidence that the common perception was incorrect. Darwin also traveled to the Galapagos Islands, which are a group of islands that are 1,000 kilometers off the coast of Ecuador. And these islands are very close together. They have similar climates, but they have different vegetation, and they have a different assortment of animals. So one of these differences are seen in tortoises and iguanas on the island. Commonly, you probably have heard of the finches on the Galapagos Islands. So you have different types of birds, basically finches that look very similar, but they have differences in their size and their beaks. Another example of that are seen in tortoise and iguanas. So Darwin observed that the characteristics of many animals and plants varied noticeably among the different islands. So he wondered to himself, well, how did these animals get here? And what happened to them once they got here? So he thought these would have evolved from an original South American ancestor that essentially came out to the island, and then once they were isolated from their original population in South America, they adapted to the environment in which they were in. And that's why they no longer looked exactly like their South American cousins, or cousins, I guess it would be, and they changed considerably. And when you actually went from one island to the other, you could see considerable changes there as well. So wondered, where did the diversity of all of this come from? And what he collected on the voyage of the HMS Beagle provided him with a lot of clues. Another thing that provided him with clues was something that had already been going on at the time, and he was already familiar with this. It's called artificial selection. This is essentially where humans bred individuals that had desirable traits in order to produce organisms that had those desirable traits as well. So humans are essentially modifying species or producing new breeds of organisms by taking individuals that had certain characteristics and mating them together to produce organisms that had those characteristics. And so in this way, humans can produce organisms that look very different from their originals and actually create new breeds. For example, wild mustard was cultivated by humans to make kale, to make Brussels sprouts, to make cabbage, to make broccoli, and to make kohlrabi. All of these came from an original, wild mustard, which was cultivated by humans, bred by humans for specific characteristics. For kale, large leaves. For Brussels sprouts, many lateral buds. For cabbage, a large terminal bud. For broccoli, lots of flowers and stems. And for kohlrabi, a nice thick stem. Another example that you're probably very familiar with is artificial selection of dogs. So all of the dogs have originally ascended from the wolf, gray wolf, I think, to be specific. That was a natural process. But once that happened, humans started taking those dogs and breeding them to look a certain way. All of the dogs are in the same species, but they look totally different. And the reason why is that humans took individuals that had characteristics that were desirable and bred them over and over and over again until you had specific breeds of dog. In Darwin's time, it was very popular to do this with pigeons. So you can see here's the original, what the original pigeon looked like, and here are all the different breeds of pigeons that were produced by way of artificial selection. Again, humans breeding for specific traits. So eventually Darwin came up with his theory of evolution by way of natural selection, right? Artificial selection is humans controlling who breeds and who lives and reproduces. Natural selection would be nature controlling that, okay? So there are 4 postulates that make up the theory of evolution. Number 1, individuals within populations are variable. Right? If you look at a population of organisms, a group of organisms of the same species that live together and breed together, you will see that there is variation among them, right? For humans, you can look across a classroom and see different eye colors, different hair colors, different skin colors, different heights. Those are all examples of variability within a population. 2, the variations among individuals are, at least in part, passed from parents to offspring. So the eye colors of individuals came from the parents. They were inherited. The hair color is inherited. The skin color is all inherited, okay? The third is in every generation, some individuals are more successful at surviving and reproducing than others. In other words, more individuals are born than will survive to reproduce, okay? So if individuals do not reproduce, then they do not pass on their characteristics. Passing on the characteristics is important for evolution to occur. So the 4th is that the survival and reproduction of individuals are not random. Instead, they are tied to the variation among individuals. The individuals with the most favorable variations, those who are best at surviving and reproducing, are naturally selected by nature to survive and to be able to reproduce. Okay? So when you get with humans kind of get muddled because humans are to the point where we have evolved brains that are large enough where we are actually deciding whether or not we want to reproduce. Whereas with animals, for the most part, they are driven by reproducing, by passing on their genes. Okay, so if they have characteristics that don't allow them to be successful at either surviving or at reproducing, then they're not going to pass on their genes, right? And so what that basically means is that individuals that are well suited for the environment are going to survive and they're going to be able to reproduce. And those characteristics that made them well suited for the environment are going to be passed on to the next generation. Those individuals that had characteristics um, that were not well suited for living may die before they reproduce, or they could have had characteristics that made them successful at living but not producing, because maybe the other members of their population didn't want to reproduce with them because they didn't have characteristics that were desirable to them. Okay, so that's essentially what evolution says. It says that whatever characteristics an individual has that make it well suited for its environment will be passed on to the next generation. Individuals that don't have those characteristics or have characteristics that are not well suited for the environment will not pass on those characteristics to the next generation. And therefore, over time, you can see if the environment stays the same, you can see that certain traits become more and more common. Okay, so relating that to artificial selection, natural selection would be nature deciding, whereas artificial selection is humans deciding. Okay, and today scientists can construct evolutionary trees based on relatedness of organisms. So here is one example of an evolutionary tree that shows primates. So here is the primate ancestor, and over here on the y-axis is millions of years ago. Okay, so here we have about 45 million years ago, we have a common ancestor with all primates. And first to break off are the lemurs and the lorises. And then we had from that original ancestor, tarsiers that also came about. Then we have an ancestor that New World monkeys and everything else and tarsiers share. Then we have an ancestor here that New World monkeys and everything else over here shares. And as you go up, you see that in evolutionary time, this is about 5 million years ago, we shared an ancestor with chimpanzees, hominids, right? About, 10 million years ago or so, we shared an ancestor with both chimpanzees and gorillas. And then about maybe 12 million years ago, we shared an ancestor with orangutans, gorillas, chimpanzees. So this is how evolutionary trees are shown, essentially, or depicted, or essentially just showing you how closely related different organisms are to each other. All right, so that's it for this video. And there is a lot of memorizing for this week, so I wanted to remind you to please start studying now. Make yourself flashcards specifically for the kingdoms and the phyla, because I know that those words are difficult to remember, but you will need to know them. You will need to be able to identify what phylum different organisms are in. Okay? So start now so that it'll be easier to follow along, because I might use the term Echinodermata and expect that you know that that means urchins and sea stars and sand dollars, okay? I might say Cnidaria, assume that you know that that means jellies and anemones and corals, okay? So if you learn it now, then it'll be easier for you to follow along in the future. All right? Again, if you have any questions, please post them under the weekly discussion. Thank you.